The town mocked the limping sheriff until he opened his suitcase of silver coins. This is the extraordinary story of Jeremiah "Jerry" Hawthorne, a man who limped into the town of Prosperity Creek with nothing but a battered suitcase and a tarnished badge, only to become the most respected lawman in the history of the Colorado Territory. You're about to witness how a community's cruelty and mockery transformed into awe and gratitude when they discovered the true measure of the man they had scorned. If this incredible tale of perseverance, justice, and unexpected redemption moves your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our inspiring stories from the American West. Now let me take you back to the autumn of 1881, to a booming mining town in the Colorado Rockies, where appearances would prove more deceiving than anyone could have imagined. The morning mist clung to the mountainside surrounding Prosperity Creek as the Denver and Rio Grande train wheezed to a stop at the small wooden platform that served as the town's depot. It was October 15th, 1881, and the aspens had turned brilliant gold against the dark green of the pine forests, creating a tapestry of color that would have taken any traveler's breath away. But the beauty of the Colorado mountains was lost on most of the residents of Prosperity Creek, a rough mining town whose population had swelled to nearly 3,000 souls in the 2 years since silver had been discovered in the surrounding hills. From the single-passenger car stepped a man who immediately drew stares and whispered comments from the small crowd gathered at the depot. Jeremiah Hawthorne was 42 years old, of medium height and lean build, with graying brown hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors. What made him the object of immediate attention, however, was the pronounced limp that affected his left leg, causing him to drag his foot slightly with each step and rely heavily on a carved wooden walking stick. He wore a simple black suit that had seen better days, a white shirt that was clean but frayed at the collar, and a black hat that had been shaped and reshaped so many times that its original form was barely recognizable. In his right hand, he carried a battered leather suitcase that looked as worn as its owner, and pinned to his coat was a sheriff's badge that had clearly seen considerable wear and had lost much of its original shine. Jerry paused on the platform, taking in his first view of Prosperity Creek with the careful assessment of a man accustomed to sizing up new situations quickly. The town sprawled along the narrow valley floor, a collection of wooden buildings, canvas tents, and hastily constructed shacks that had grown up around the mining operations. Main Street was a muddy thoroughfare lined with saloons, general stores, boarding houses, and the various businesses that catered to the needs of miners, prospectors, and the merchants who followed the silver strikes. Even from the depot, Jerry could hear the sounds that characterized a booming mining town, the constant hammering and sawing of new construction, the rumble of ore wagons heading to and from the mines, the shouts of men conducting business in the street, and the distant thunder of dynamite blasts echoing from the mountainsides where miners worked to extract precious metal from the stubborn rock. But it was the people gathered at the depot who drew Jerry's most careful attention. They were watching him with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed amusement, their expressions making it clear that his appearance had not impressed them favorably. He could hear fragments of their whispered conversations, comments about his limp, his worn clothing, and the obvious poverty of his circumstances. "Look at that, will you?" muttered one man to his companion, not bothering to lower his voice significantly. "That's supposed to be our new sheriff. He can barely walk straight, much less keep order in a place like this." "Heard he's coming from some little farming town down south," replied another voice. "Probably never seen real trouble in his life. Won't last a week here before he's running back to wherever he came from." Jerry heard these comments and many others like them, but his expression remained impassive. He'd faced skepticism and mockery before, and he'd learned long ago that actions spoke louder than appearances. He shouldered his suitcase and began the slow walk down Main Street toward the sheriff's office, his cane tapping rhythmically on the wooden sidewalk. Prosperity Creek had been without effective law enforcement for nearly 2 months, ever since the previous sheriff, a man named Bull Garrett, had been gunned down in the street by a gang of claim jumpers. Garrett had been a large, intimidating man with a reputation for using his fists as much as his gun to maintain order. But even he had been overwhelmed by the lawlessness that seemed to increase with each new silver strike. The town council, desperate for any kind of law enforcement, had sent telegrams to sheriffs throughout Colorado and neighboring territories, offering the position to anyone willing to take it. The salary was generous by frontier standards, but the job came with significant risks. Prosperity Creek was plagued by claim disputes, robbery, assault, and all the violence that typically accompanied mining booms. Most experienced lawmen had declined the offer, preferring safer positions in more civilized communities. Jerry Hawthorne had been serving as sheriff in a small farming community called Cedar Ridge, about 100 miles south of Prosperity Creek, when he received the telegram offering him the position. Cedar Ridge was quiet and peaceful, with crime limited mostly to occasional disputes between neighbors and the rare incident of cattle rustling. For most men, it would have been an ideal position, but Jerry had reasons for wanting to move to a more challenging environment. As he made his way down Main Street, Jerry took careful note of his new domain. The first thing that struck him was the obvious wealth generated by the silver mining. Despite its rough appearance, Prosperity Creek was clearly a prosperous community. The general stores were well stocked with goods that would have been luxuries in most frontier towns. The saloons were numerous and busy, even in the middle of the day. Construction was going on everywhere, with new buildings rising to accommodate the growing population. But Jerry's experienced eye also noted the signs of a community without effective law enforcement. Groups of men loitered in the streets, many of them obviously armed and some showing signs of recent fights. The windows of several businesses bore the marks of bullet holes, hastily patched but still visible. Drunken men stumbled from saloon to saloon, even though it was barely noon, and the general atmosphere was one of barely controlled chaos. The sheriff's office was located in a sturdy stone building near the center of town, one of the few permanent structures in a community that had grown too quickly for proper planning. Jerry pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, immediately noting the musty smell of a building that had been closed up for too long. The office consisted of a main room with a desk, filing cabinets, and a gun rack that held several rifles and shotguns. Beyond the main room were 4 jail cells, all currently empty, but showing signs of recent occupancy. On the desk was a stack of papers and reports, apparently left by the previous sheriff, along with keys, official seals, and other tools of law enforcement. Jerry set down his suitcase and walked around the office, familiarizing himself with the layout and taking inventory of the available resources. The gun rack was well stocked. The cells appeared secure, and there was even a small living area in the back where the sheriff could sleep if necessary. It was better equipped than many sheriff's offices he'd seen, reflecting the town's prosperity and the dangerous nature of the job. As he was examining the desk and its contents, the door opened and 3 men entered. They were clearly members of the town council, dressed in the fine clothes that marked them as successful merchants or mine owners. The leader of the group was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a carefully groomed beard and expensive suit. "Sheriff Hawthorne, I presume?" the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Mayor Benjamin Crawford. These are council members Robert Hayes and Thomas Mitchell. We're glad you could make it to Prosperity Creek." Jerry shook hands with each of the men, noting the careful way they tried to conceal their disappointment at his appearance. He could see them taking in his limp, his worn clothes, and his general lack of the intimidating presence they'd probably been hoping for in a sheriff. "Gentlemen," Jerry replied in a calm, steady voice, "I'm here to do a job, and I intend to do it well, but I'll need your support and cooperation." Mayor Crawford nodded, though Jerry could see doubt in his eyes. "Of course, Sheriff, we want you to succeed, but I have to be honest with you. This town is rougher than most. We've had 3 sheriffs in the past year, and 2 of them are dead. The work here is dangerous, and it requires a man who can handle himself in violent situations." Jerry met the mayor's gaze steadily. "I understand the risks, Mayor Crawford. I wouldn't have taken the position if I didn't think I could handle it." This council member Hayes spoke up, his tone skeptical. "No offense, Sheriff, but you don't exactly look like the kind of man who strikes fear into the hearts of hardened criminals. How do you plan to maintain order among men who make their living with dynamite and guns?" It was a fair question, and Jerry had heard variations of it many times throughout his career. His limp and unimpressive physical appearance had caused people to underestimate him since he'd first pinned on a badge, and he'd learned to use their assumptions to his advantage. "Mr. Hayes," Jerry replied calmly, "effective law enforcement isn't about intimidation or physical presence. It's about understanding human nature, applying the law fairly, and having the courage to do what's right, even when it's dangerous. Size and strength matter less than intelligence and determination." Councilmember Mitchell looked unconvinced. "That's a nice philosophy, Sheriff, but philosophy doesn't stop bullets or break up bar fights. This town needs a man who can handle himself with his fists and his gun." Jerry nodded acknowledgement of their concerns. "I understand your doubts, gentlemen. All I ask is that you give me a chance to prove myself. If I can't do the job effectively, you'll know it soon enough." Mayor Crawford exchanged glances with the other council members, and Jerry could see them having a silent conversation about whether they'd made a mistake in hiring him. Finally, Crawford spoke again. "Very well, Sheriff Hawthorne, the job is yours, at least for now. But I have to warn you, there are some very dangerous men in this town, and they won't show you any respect just because you wear a badge. The Dalton gang has been operating in this area, robbing claims and terrorizing miners. The saloons are full of men who settle disputes with guns rather than words, and there are claim jumpers, thieves, and murderers who see law enforcement as an obstacle to their operations." Jerry listened carefully to the mayor's warnings, filing away information that would be crucial to his success in this new position. "I appreciate the briefing, Mayor. Is there anything else I should know about the specific challenges I'll be facing?" Hayes pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "This is a list of the men who are considered the most dangerous in town. At the top is Jake Morrison, who runs the biggest saloon and gambling operation. He's been suspected of claim jumping and robbery, but no sheriff has been able to prove anything against him. Below him are his associates and various other troublemakers who've been causing problems." Jerry took the list and scanned it quickly, memorizing names and noting the descriptions provided. It was clear that Prosperity Creek was home to a significant criminal element, men who had been drawn to the mining boom, not just by the prospect of legitimate wealth, but by the opportunities for illegal gain that always accompanied such rapid growth and limited law enforcement. After the town council members left, Jerry spent the rest of the afternoon settling into his new position. He unpacked his few belongings, placing them in the small living area behind the office. His possessions were sparse: a few changes of clothes, some personal items, a well-worn Bible, and several books on law enforcement techniques. Everything he owned fit easily into the single room, reflecting a life spent in simple circumstances. But it was the battered suitcase that drew the most attention from curious onlookers who passed by the sheriff's office throughout the day. Word had spread quickly through town about the new sheriff's arrival, and many people found excuses to walk past the office windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who was supposed to restore order to their chaotic community. What they saw didn't inspire much confidence. Jerry moved slowly due to his limp-handled documents, with the careful precision of a clerk, rather than the bold assertiveness they expected from a lawman, and generally appeared to be exactly what he was: a middle-aged man with a physical disability trying to do a job that seemed beyond his capabilities. The mockery began almost immediately. Within hours of Jerry's arrival, Jokes were circulating through the saloons and gambling halls about the crippled sheriff who was supposed to tame Prosperity Creek. Men who had never feared the law in their lives laughed openly about the idea that this limping figure could pose any threat to their operations. Jake Morrison, the saloon owner and suspected criminal leader mentioned by the town council, made his opinions known to anyone who would listen. "Boys," he announced in his establishment that evening, "I think our law enforcement problems are over. Not because we have an effective sheriff, but because we have one who won't be able to chase anybody faster than a walk." The laughter that greeted Morrison's comment echoed through the saloon and spilled out onto the street, where passers-by could hear the mirth generated by the new sheriff's apparent inadequacy. Similar scenes played out in gambling halls, brothels and mining camps throughout the area, as word spread about the disappointing figure who was supposed to bring order to their lawless community. Jerry, working late in his office by lamplight, could hear the laughter and comments drifting through the evening air. He'd heard it all before, in other towns and other circumstances, and he'd learned to let such mockery roll off him like water off a duck's back. He knew that actions would speak louder than appearances, and he was prepared to let his work demonstrate his capabilities. But there was something different about this situation, something that even Jerry couldn't have anticipated. Unknown to the people of Prosperity Creek, their new sheriff carried with him a secret that would eventually transform their mockery into amazement and their doubt into respect. The battered suitcase that had drawn so much attention contained far more than anyone imagined, and its contents would soon play a crucial role in establishing Jerry's authority in ways that no one could have predicted. Jerry's first full day as sheriff of Prosperity Creek began before dawn, as was his long-time habit. He'd learned over the years that early morning was often the calmest time in a frontier town, when the previous night's revelry had ended and the new day's troubles hadn't yet begun. It was the ideal time for a lawman to walk the streets, assess conditions, and plan his approach to the challenges ahead. As he prepared for his morning patrol, Jerry checked his weapons with the careful attention of a man whose life might depend on their proper function. His primary sidearm was a Colt single-action army revolver, .45 caliber, with a well-worn grip that showed years of regular use. The gun was clean, oiled, and loaded with 6 cartridges, and Jerry wore it in a simple leather holster on his right hip. But it was Jerry's backup weapon that would have surprised anyone who assumed they knew everything about him based on his appearance. Concealed beneath his coat was a short-barreled shotgun, sawed off to a length that made it easily concealable but devastatingly effective at close range. This weapon was Jerry's insurance policy, a tool that had saved his life on more than one occasion when his limp had prevented him from drawing his pistol quickly enough. Jerry's morning patrol took him the length of Main Street and through the side streets and alleys that branched off from the main thoroughfare. He walked slowly, partly because of his physical limitation, but also because he wanted to observe everything carefully, noting the locations of businesses, identifying potential trouble spots, and getting a feel for the rhythms of daily life in his new jurisdiction. What he saw confirmed his initial assessment that Prosperity Creek was a town balanced on the edge of chaos. Evidence of the previous night's activities was everywhere. Broken glass from bar fights, bloodstains on sidewalks, and the occasional unconscious drunk sleeping off his excesses in doorways or alleys. The jail should have been full of men arrested for disturbing the peace, assault and public intoxication. But it was empty because there had been no one to make arrests. As Jerry made his rounds, he encountered the typical cast of characters found in any mining town. Miners heading to work in the hills, merchants opening their establishments for the day's business, women hanging laundry or sweeping storefronts, and children playing in the streets despite the early hour. Most people he passed looked at him with curiosity, taking in his limp and his badge with expressions that ranged from hope to skepticism. But it was the group of men loitering outside Morrison's saloon who presented Jerry with his first real test as sheriff of Prosperity Creek. There were 5 of them, all clearly members of Morrison's organization, and they were obviously waiting for the new sheriff to make his morning patrol. As Jerry approached, they spread out across the sidewalk, forcing him to either walk around them or confront them directly. The leader of the group was a large man with a scarred face and arms like tree trunks, introduced by his companions as Iron Mike Sullivan. He was exactly the kind of intimidating figure that most people expected to see wearing a sheriff's badge, and the contrast between his imposing presence and Jerry's modest appearance couldn't have been more stark. "Well, well," Iron Mike said in a voice loud enough to draw attention from other early risers on the street. "If it isn't our new sheriff. I heard you were quite a sight to behold, but I had to see for myself." Jerry stopped about 10 feet from the group, close enough to talk normally, but far enough to have room to maneuver if the situation turned violent. He kept his expression calm and his voice steady as he responded. "Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Sheriff Hawthorne. I'm new to town and I'm still learning my way around. Is there something I can help you with?" Iron Mike's companions chuckled at Jerry's polite tone, clearly interpreting it as a sign of weakness rather than professionalism. Iron Mike himself grinned, showing teeth that had been broken and poorly repaired. "Help us?" he repeated with mock surprise. "Well, now that you mention it, Sheriff, there is something you could help us with. You could save everyone a lot of trouble by getting back on that train and heading to some nice, quiet town where a man with your limitations might be more suited to the work." The insult was delivered with enough volume to ensure that everyone within earshot could hear it, and Jerry could see people beginning to gather to watch the confrontation. He understood that this was more than just harassment. It was a test of his authority that would determine how he was treated by every criminal element in town. "I appreciate the advice," Jerry replied calmly, "but I'm afraid I can't take it. I've accepted the position of sheriff, and I intend to do my job to the best of my ability. That means enforcing the law fairly and protecting the citizens of this community from those who would harm them." Iron Mike's grin faded, replaced by an expression of contempt. "Enforcing the law? Protecting citizens? Sheriff, you can barely protect yourself. How do you figure to handle real trouble when it comes looking for you?" Jerry shifted his weight slightly, a movement that appeared to be simply adjusting his stance to accommodate his limp, but actually positioned him for quick access to his concealed shotgun if necessary. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the quiet words. "Mr. Sullivan, I assume that's your name based on what your friends have been calling you. I'm going to give you some free advice. The badge I wear represents the authority of the territorial government and the will of the people of this community. Threatening a sheriff is a serious crime, punishable by significant jail time. I'd recommend that you and your associates move along and go about your business." Iron Mike laughed, but there was less confidence in the sound than there had been moments earlier. Something in Jerry's tone, despite his physical appearance, suggested that the new sheriff might not be as easy to intimidate as they'd expected. "Or what?" Iron Mike challenged. "What exactly are you going to do if we don't move along? Arrest all 5 of us single-handed? Chase us down with that gimp leg of yours?" Jerry's expression didn't change, but his hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to the concealed shotgun. "Mr. Sullivan, you're making assumptions about my capabilities based on my appearance. That's a mistake that could prove costly for all of us. I'm asking you politely to disperse. I won't ask again." For a moment, the situation hung in balance. Iron Mike and his associates clearly hadn't expected the new sheriff to stand up to them, much less threaten to arrest them. They were trying to decide whether to escalate the confrontation or back down, and Jerry could see the calculation going on behind their eyes. The decision was made for them by the arrival of Mayor Crawford and several other town council members who had apparently been alerted to the confrontation and had come to see how their new sheriff would handle his first challenge. The presence of the town's leadership changed the dynamics of the situation, making it more difficult for Iron Mike to simply attack the sheriff without facing serious consequences. "Is there a problem here?" Mayor Crawford asked. though it was clear from his tone that he knew exactly what was happening. Jerry replied without taking his eyes off Iron Mike. "No problem, Mayor. Mr. Sullivan and his friends were just leaving." Iron Mike stared at Jerry for several more seconds, clearly frustrated by his inability to intimidate the new sheriff, but unwilling to start a gunfight with the town council as witnesses. Finally, he stepped back, gesturing for his companions to follow suit. "This isn't over, Sheriff," he said as he moved away. "You can't hide behind that badge forever. Sooner or later, you're going to have to prove you can do more than talk." Jerry watched until Iron Mike and his associates had disappeared into Morrison's saloon, then turned to address the town council members who had witnessed the confrontation. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I think you can see what I meant yesterday about law enforcement being more about intelligence and determination than physical presence. Mr. Sullivan expected me to back down, and when I didn't, he was the one who had to retreat." Mayor Crawford nodded, though Jerry could see that the mayor was still skeptical about his new sheriff's ability to handle more serious challenges. "That was well handled, Sheriff, but Iron Mike Sullivan isn't going to forget this incident. He's going to be looking for a way to settle the score, and next time he might not be as restrained." "I understand that, Mayor, but backing down from the first challenge would have made it impossible for me to enforce the law effectively. Sometimes you have to take risks to establish authority." The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation began to disperse, and Jerry could hear fragments of conversation as people discussed what they'd witnessed. The reactions were mixed. Some people were impressed that the new sheriff had stood up to Iron Mike Sullivan, while others seemed to think he'd just delayed an inevitable confrontation that he couldn't win. Jerry completed his morning patrol without further incident, but he knew that word of his encounter with Iron Mike would spread quickly through town. By evening, everyone in Prosperity Creek would know that their new sheriff had faced down one of the town's most notorious troublemakers, and they would all be wondering what would happen when the inevitable rematch occurred. That evening, as Jerry sat in his office working on reports and familiarizing himself with local ordinances, he reflected on the challenge he faced in establishing his authority in such a lawless community. His physical limitations made it impossible for him to rely on the intimidation tactics that many frontier sheriffs use to maintain order. Instead, he would have to depend on intelligence, preparation, and the element of surprise that came from being consistently underestimated by his opponents. But Jerry had advantages that his critics couldn't see, resources that he'd accumulated over years of law enforcement in various challenging environments. The battered suitcase that had drawn so much mockery contained far more than worn clothing and personal possessions. Hidden beneath a false bottom was a collection of items that represented Jerry's secret weapon in his fight against lawlessness: silver coins, each one a reminder of a criminal brought to justice and a reward earned through courage and determination. The coins had been accumulating for nearly 20 years, ever since Jerry had first become a lawman in a small town in Kansas. Each coin represented a bounty paid for the capture of a wanted criminal, a reward offered by grateful citizens for the recovery of stolen property, or payment for special services rendered to territorial governments struggling to maintain order in their remote jurisdictions. Some of the coins were Mexican silver pesos, earned during Jerry's time as a deputy marshal along the border, where he'd helped track down bandits who preyed on trade routes between Texas and Mexico. Others were American silver dollars, rewards for capturing rustlers, claim jumpers, and other criminals who operated in the mining regions of Colorado and Nevada. But the most valuable coins in Jerry's collection were the rare pieces he'd acquired through his involvement in some of the most significant law enforcement operations of his career. There was a Spanish colonial 8 reales coin, worth far more than its silver content, that he'd received as a bonus for helping to break up a counterfeiting ring in California. There were several Morgan silver dollars in pristine condition, gifts from a grateful mine owner whose operations Jerry had protected from a gang of claim jumpers in Arizona. The total value of Jerry's coin collection was substantial, representing not just monetary wealth, but a lifetime of successful law enforcement in some of the most challenging environments on the American frontier. But more than their material worth, the coins represented Jerry's credentials, proof of his competence and effectiveness in situations that had defeated other lawmen. Jerry had learned to keep his success stories and his accumulated wealth secret, knowing that frontier communities often reacted poorly to lawmen who seemed to be profiting too much from their positions. But the coins were his insurance policy, resources he could draw upon when circumstances required extraordinary measures to maintain law and order. As he sat in his office that night, Jerry carefully examined several of the coins, remembering the circumstances under which he'd earned each one. There was the silver peso he'd received for tracking down a gang of cattle rustlers in New Mexico, a chase that had lasted 3 weeks and covered hundreds of miles of desert terrain. There was the $50 commemorating his role in capturing a notorious stagecoach robber who had eluded capture for over 2 years. Each coin told a story of persistence, courage, and ultimate success in the face of seemingly impossible odds. They were reminders that appearances could be deceiving, that a limping sheriff with worn clothes and a modest demeanor could be more effective than the most intimidating gunfighter when it came to bringing criminals to justice. Jerry's second day as sheriff of Prosperity Creek brought new challenges that would test both his patience and his resolve. He was awakened before dawn by gunshots and shouting from the direction of the mining district, where a dispute over a claim boundary had escalated into violence. By the time he arrived at the scene, limping as quickly as he could manage through the pre-dawn darkness, 2 men were wounded, and a crowd of angry miners was demanding that someone take action. The dispute involved the Red Mountain Mine and the adjacent Silverado claim, both of which were producing significant amounts of high-grade ore. The boundary between the 2 properties had been surveyed incorrectly, creating an overlap where both operations believed they had legal rights to mine. The situation had been simmering for weeks, with threats and accusations flying between the 2 groups of miners, but it had finally erupted into open violence when the Silverado crew had tried to dynamite a new tunnel that the Red Mountain miners claimed was on their property. Jerry found himself in the middle of a crowd of armed and angry men, all of whom seemed ready to resume fighting at the slightest provocation. The wounded men were being tended by their colleagues, but both groups were demanding that Jerry arrest members of the opposing side for assault and trespassing. "Sheriff!" called out Jim Bradley, the foreman of the Red Mountain operation. "These claim jumpers shot 2 of my men when we tried to stop them from stealing our ore. I want them all arrested and charged with attempted murder." "Ma, that's a lie!" shouted back Pete Morrison, who supervised the Silverado claim and was Jake Morrison's brother. "Your men started the shooting when they tried to destroy our equipment. We were just defending our legal rights to our own property." Jerry stood in the center of the crowd, using his walking stick to help maintain his balance on the uneven ground, and listened to the accusations flying from both sides. It was clear that this was more than just a boundary dispute. It was a conflict between 2 powerful factions in the community, each with their own supporters and their own version of events. "Gentlemen," Jerry said in a voice loud enough to cut through the shouting, "I need everyone to calm down so we can sort this out properly. Fighting in the streets isn't going to resolve your boundary dispute, and it's only going to get more people hurt." "Easy for you to say, Sheriff," Pete Morrison replied with obvious contempt. "You're not the one losing thousands of dollars because of illegal mining operations. What are you going to do about it? Arrest everyone and let the judge sort it out?" Jerry could see that the crowd was watching him carefully, waiting to see how he would handle this complex and dangerous situation. Both groups of miners were heavily armed, emotions were running high, and any wrong move could restart the violence with even more serious consequences. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Bradley," Jerry said calmly, "here's what we're going to do. First, Everyone is going to put away their weapons. This is now a crime scene, and I won't tolerate any more violence. Second, I want representatives from both sides to meet with me at the sheriff's office this afternoon to present their evidence about the boundary dispute. Third, all mining operations in the disputed area will cease until we can get a proper survey done and resolve this matter legally. Both foremen started to object immediately, but Jerry held up his hand for silence. Those are not suggestions, gentlemen. Those are orders from a duly appointed officer of the territorial government. Anyone who interferes with this investigation or attempts to resume mining in the disputed area will be arrested and charged with obstruction of justice. Pete Morrison stepped closer to Jerry, his expression threatening. Sheriff, you don't understand the situation here. This isn't some little farm town where you can order people around and expect them to obey. This is a mining camp, and we settle our disputes our own way. Jerry met Morrison's stare without flinching, his own voice remaining calm, but carrying an undertone of steel. Mr. Morrison, I understand the situation perfectly. What you don't seem to understand is that the law applies here just as much as anywhere else. Now I'm going to ask you one more time to disperse your men and await the legal resolution of this dispute. If you refuse, I'll be forced to take more direct action. The crowd was silent, watching the confrontation between the new sheriff and one of the most powerful men in the mining district. Everyone could see that Morrison was testing Jerry's authority, just as Iron Mike Sullivan had done the previous day, and they were all wondering how the limping lawman would enforce his orders if Morrison chose to defy him. Morrison looked around at his supporters, clearly expecting them to back him up in a direct challenge to the sheriff's authority. But something in Jerry's demeanor gave them pause. Despite his physical limitations and unimpressive appearance, there was something about the new sheriff that suggested he was more dangerous than he looked. "All right, Sheriff," Morrison said finally, stepping back but keeping his voice defiant. "We'll play this your way for now, but if you can't resolve this situation quickly and fairly, we'll handle it ourselves." Jerry nodded acknowledgement of the implicit threat. "Mr. Morrison, I'll resolve this situation according to the law, which is the only fair way to handle it. I'll expect you and Mr. Bradley in my office at 2 o'clock this afternoon with all relevant documents and witnesses." As the crowd began to disperse, Jerry remained at the scene long enough to examine the physical evidence of the conflict and take statements from witnesses. The boundary dispute was clearly complex, involving surveying errors, conflicting legal documents, and thousands of dollars in mining rights. It was exactly the kind of problem that required careful investigation and diplomatic resolution rather than the quick, decisive action that most frontier sheriffs preferred. But Jerry had dealt with similar disputes before, and he knew that taking the time to gather all the facts and apply the law properly would ultimately produce a more lasting resolution than trying to impose a quick fix through force or intimidation. That afternoon, Jerry's office was crowded with representatives from both mining operations, their lawyers, and several town council members who had a financial interest in resolving the dispute quickly. Jerry had spent the morning reviewing territorial laws regarding mining claims and studying the surveying documents that both sides had provided. What he found was a situation that was more complex than either side had admitted. The original survey had indeed contained errors, but both mining operations had made improvements and investments based on their understanding of the correct boundaries. Simply awarding the disputed area to one side or the other would cause significant financial harm to whichever side lost. "Gentlemen," Jerry announced after reviewing all the evidence, "I've reached a decision on this matter. The boundary dispute arose from errors in the original survey, errors that neither side was responsible for. Both operations have made substantial investments based on their good faith understanding of their property rights." The room was silent as everyone waited to hear Jerry's solution to what had seemed like an intractable problem. "Therefore," Jerry continued, I'm ordering a new professional survey to establish the correct boundary between the properties. Until that survey is completed, both operations will suspend mining in the disputed area. When the correct boundary is established, any ore that has been extracted from the disputed area will be divided between the two operations in proportion to how much of the disputed area actually belongs to each claim. Both sides started to object, but Jerry held up his hand for silence. Furthermore, he added, to ensure that this solution is fair to both parties, I'm recommending that the costs of the new survey be shared equally between the two operations and that an independent assayer be brought in to determine the value of any ore extracted from the disputed area. Jim Bradley spoke up first. Sheriff, that's going to cost both operations a lot of money and delay our mining activities for weeks. Mr. Bradley, Jerry replied, it's going to cost both operations far less than continued violence and legal disputes. And it's certainly going to cost less than having your miners killed in gunfights over ore that might not even belong to you. Pete Morrison was clearly unhappy with the decision, but he could see that Jerry's solution was fair and legally sound. All right, Sheriff, we'll go along with your decision, but I want that survey done as quickly as possible. Every day we're not mining costs us money. I understand your concerns, Mr. Morrison. I'll contact the Territorial Surveyor's office tomorrow and request that this dispute be given priority. In the meantime, I expect both operations to comply with my order to suspend mining in the disputed area. After the meeting ended and the various parties had left his office, Jerry reflected on his success in resolving a potentially explosive situation through careful application of the law rather than through force or intimidation. It was exactly the kind of victory that his critics couldn't see or understand, a demonstration of effective law enforcement that didn't involve gunfights or dramatic arrests. But Jerry knew that his success in handling the mining dispute would do little to change the opinions of those who judged him solely on his physical appearance. The real test of his authority would come when he faced the kind of direct criminal activity that couldn't be resolved through negotiation and legal procedures. That test came sooner than he expected. 3 days after resolving the mining dispute, Jerry was awakened in the middle of the night by urgent pounding on the door of the sheriff's office. He dressed quickly and opened the door to find a young miner named Tommy Collins, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Sheriff," Tommy gasped, still breathing hard from running. "You need to come quick. There's been a robbery at the Silver Dollar Mine, and they shot the night watchman." Jerry grabbed his coat, checked his weapons, and followed Tommy into the dark streets of Prosperity Creek. The Silver Dollar Mine was located about 2 miles outside of town, up a winding mountain road that would be treacherous in the darkness. Jerry knew that his limp would make the journey difficult, but there was no choice but to respond to the emergency as quickly as possible. Tommy had brought a horse for Jerry, understanding that the sheriff would need transportation to reach the mine quickly. Jerry wasn't an experienced rider, and his physical limitation made mounting and controlling the horse challenging, but he managed to stay in the saddle as they rode through the night toward the scene of the crime. When they arrived at the Silver Dollar Mine, Jerry found a scene of chaos and confusion. The night watchman, an elderly man named Pete Williams, had been shot in the shoulder and was being tended by several miners who had been awakened by the gunshots. The mine's safe had been blown open with dynamite, and a substantial amount of silver ore and cash had been stolen. Jerry immediately began investigating the crime scene, examining the evidence and interviewing witnesses despite the darkness and confusion. What he found suggested that this had been a professional operation, carried out by experienced criminals who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to get it. The robbers had cut the telegraph wires leading from the mine to town, preventing immediate notification of the crime. They had used dynamite to blow open the safe, indicating knowledge of explosives and mining techniques. Most significantly, they had shot the watchman in a way that disabled him, but wasn't immediately fatal, suggesting that they were trying to avoid a murder charge while still eliminating a witness. "How many of them were there?" Jerry asked Pete Williams as the wounded watchman was being prepared for transport to town for medical treatment. "3, maybe 4, Williams replied through gritted teeth. "They were wearing bandanas over their faces, so I couldn't see them clearly. But one of them was a big man, real big, and he seemed to be giving the orders to the others." Jerry filed away this information, already beginning to form theories about who might be responsible for the robbery. The description of a large leader fit Iron Mike Sullivan, and the professional nature of the operation suggested involvement by Jake Morrison's organization. "Did they say anything?" Jerry asked. "Anything that might help identify them?" Williams thought for a moment. "The big one, the leader, he said something about teaching the new sheriff a lesson. Said something about showing the town what happens when they hire cripples to do a man's job." Jerry felt a cold anger settle in his chest. This robbery wasn't just about money. It was a direct challenge to his authority and a message to the community that he couldn't protect them from criminal activity. The robbers had deliberately timed their crime to test his response and demonstrate his inadequacy as a lawman. But Jerry had faced such challenges before, and he knew that his response would determine whether he could establish effective law enforcement in Prosperity Creek or whether he would be forced to admit defeat and leave town in disgrace. As dawn broke over the mountains, Jerry organized a posse to pursue the robbers. Despite his physical limitations, he insisted on leading the pursuit himself, knowing that his authority depended on his willingness to take personal risks in the performance of his duties. The trail left by the robbers was clear in the soft earth of the mountain paths, and Jerry's experience in tracking criminals served him well despite his lack of familiarity with the local terrain. The posse followed the trail for several hours, climbing higher into the mountains and moving deeper into the wilderness that surrounded Prosperity Creek. But as the day progressed, it became clear that the robbers had planned their escape route carefully, leading the posse through increasingly difficult terrain that favored their escape over pursuit. Jerry's limp made the rough going even more challenging for him, and he could see that some members of the posse were beginning to question whether their sheriff was physically capable of leading such an expedition. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a high mountain meadow where the robbers' trail seemed to disappear into rocky ground that showed no clear tracks. Jerry studied the area carefully, using skills he'd developed over years of tracking criminals through difficult terrain. But even his experience couldn't overcome the robbers' head start and their obvious familiarity with the local geography. "Sheriff," said one of the posse members, a miner named Jack Harrison, "I think we've lost them. They could have gone in any direction from here, and we don't have enough daylight left to check all the possibilities." Jerry knew that Harrison was right, but he also knew that returning to town empty-handed would be seen as confirmation of his inadequacy as a sheriff. The community was watching to see how he would handle his first major criminal investigation, and his failure to capture the robbers would be interpreted as proof that he lacked the skills and determination necessary for the job. "We'll make camp here tonight," Jerry decided. "In the morning, we'll spread out and check all the possible routes. These men are carrying heavy loads of silver ore, which will slow them down and make them easier to track once we find their trail again." That night, as the posse camped in the mountain meadow, Jerry lay awake thinking about the challenge he faced. He was physically exhausted from the day's difficult travel, his limp was causing him significant pain, and he knew that some of the men in the posse were beginning to doubt his leadership. But he also knew that giving up now would mean the end of his career as sheriff of Prosperity Creek, and would leave the community at the mercy of the criminal elements that were clearly growing bolder in their operations. Jerry had faced similar situations before, moments when conventional law enforcement methods had failed, and he'd been forced to rely on his secret resources to achieve success. The battered suitcase back in his office contained more than just silver coins. It also contained information and contacts that he'd developed over years of law enforcement work throughout the Western Territories. One of Jerry's most valuable resources was his network of informants and contacts in the criminal underworld, men who sold information about criminal activities in exchange for money or reduced sentences for their own crimes. Over the years, Jerry had cultivated relationships with these sources, building an intelligence network that often proved more valuable than conventional investigative techniques. Jerry knew that the Silver Dollar Mine robbery bore all the hallmarks of Jake Morrison's organization, and he suspected that Iron Mike Sullivan had been the large leader described by the wounded watchman. But suspicion wasn't proof, and Jerry would need solid evidence before he could make arrests that would stand up in court. The next morning, Jerry made a decision that surprised the members of his posse. Instead of continuing the pursuit into the mountains, he announced that they would return to town and pursue the investigation through other means. "Sheriff," Jack Harrison protested, "if we give up now, those robbers are going to get clean away with the silver and the money they stole." Jerry looked out at the vast wilderness that surrounded them, calculating the odds of success if they continued the pursuit. "Mr. Harrison, these men know this country better than we do. They have at least a 12-hour head start, and they've planned their escape route carefully. We could spend weeks searching these mountains without finding them, and while we're gone, they could double back and rob another mine." Aye. The posse members exchanged glances, clearly disappointed by their sheriff's decision to abandon the pursuit. Jerry could see that they interpreted his decision as evidence of his physical inability to handle the demands of the job, rather than as a strategic choice to pursue other investigative avenues. "But Sheriff," another posse member argued, "what are we going to tell the people back in town? They're expecting us to bring back the robbers and the stolen silver." Jerry met the man's gaze steadily. "We're going to tell them the truth, that the robbers had too much of a head start and knew the country too well for a direct pursuit to be successful. But we're also going to tell them that this investigation is far from over, and that these criminals will be brought to justice through other means." As the posse rode back toward Prosperity Creek, Jerry was already planning his next moves in the investigation. He knew that the robbery had been planned and executed by local criminals, which meant that evidence of their guilt could be found in town rather than in the wilderness. He also knew that the stolen silver ore would have to be disposed of somehow, and that process would create opportunities for detection and arrest. But most importantly, Jerry knew that it was time to reveal some of his hidden resources and demonstrate that there was more to the new sheriff than his critics had assumed. The battered suitcase in his office was about to play a crucial role in bringing the Silver Dollar Mine robbers to justice and establishing his authority as an effective lawman. When the posse returned to Prosperity Creek that evening, they were greeted by crowds of curious townspeople who had been waiting to hear the results of the pursuit. Jerry could see disappointment and skepticism in many faces as it became clear that the robbers had not been captured and the stolen property had not been recovered. Jake Morrison was among the crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office, and he made no effort to hide his satisfaction at Jerry's apparent failure. "Well, Sheriff," Morrison called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "it looks like our first real crime was a little too much for you to handle. Maybe next time you'll think twice before taking on a job that requires real detective work." Jerry ignored Morrison's taunt and addressed the crowd in general. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to assure you that the investigation into the Silver Dollar Mine robbery is continuing. While the immediate pursuit was unsuccessful, we have other means of identifying and apprehending the criminals responsible." "What other means?" someone called out from the crowd. "You can't even track criminals on horseback. How are you going to catch professional robbers?" Jerry looked directly at the man who had asked the question. "Sir, effective law enforcement involves more than just chasing criminals through the mountains. It requires intelligence gathering, evidence analysis, and the ability to anticipate criminal behavior. I have resources and experience that haven't been utilized yet in this investigation." Morrison laughed openly at Jerry's statement. "Resources and experience? Sheriff, the only resource you seem to have is that old suitcase you carried off the train, and the only experience you've demonstrated is the ability to get lost in the wilderness." Jerry felt the familiar stirring of anger that he'd learned to control over years of facing mockery and doubt. But this time, he decided that it was time to surprise his critics and demonstrate that appearances could be more deceiving than anyone imagined. "Mr. Morrison," Jerry said calmly, "you're right that I have resources that people don't know about. In fact, I think it's time to show the community exactly what kind of resources a sheriff can accumulate over 20 years of successful law enforcement." Jerry turned and walked into his office, leaving the crowd outside to wonder what he meant by his cryptic statement. Inside, he went to the battered suitcase that had been the object of so much mockery and derision since his arrival in Prosperity Creek. For the first time since arriving in town, Jerry opened the suitcase and revealed its contents to another person. But instead of the worn clothing and meager possessions that everyone expected to see, Jerry lifted out a heavy canvas bag that clinked with the unmistakable sound of metal coins. Jerry carried the bag outside and set it on the wooden sidewalk in front of his office, where the lamplight from the building illuminated its contents clearly for all to see. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he untied the bag and poured out a stream of silver coins that sparkled and gleamed in the yellow light. The crowd fell silent as they stared at the pile of silver coins at Jerry's feet. There were dozens of them, representing various mints and time periods, but all clearly genuine silver and obviously valuable. The total worth of the collection was more than most people in Prosperity Creek earned in several years of hard work. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jerry announced, in a voice that carried clearly through the stunned silence, "these coins represent 20 years of successful law enforcement in some of the most challenging environments on the American frontier. Each coin was earned through the capture of wanted criminals, the recovery of stolen property, or the successful resolution of complex criminal investigations." Jerry picked up one of the coins, a pristine Morgan silver dollar, and held it up for everyone to see. This coin was a reward for capturing the leader of a cattle rustling operation in Wyoming. The rustlers had been stealing cattle for 2 years before I was brought in to stop them. It took me 3 months to gather enough evidence to identify the gang and track them to their hideout. He picked up another coin, this one a Mexican peso with intricate designs around its edge. This coin was payment for helping the territorial government of New Mexico break up a counterfeiting ring that was flooding the territory with fake money. The investigation required 6 months of undercover work and resulted in the arrest of 12 criminals. Jerry continued displaying coins and describing the circumstances under which he'd earned them, each story revealing another aspect of his hidden competence and experience. The crowd listened in stunned silence as they realized that the man they'd been mocking and dismissing was actually one of the most successful lawmen in the Western Territories. "The point I'm trying to make," Jerry concluded as he began returning the coins to their bag, "is that effective law enforcement isn't about physical intimidation or dramatic gestures. It's about patience, intelligence, and the determination to see justice done, regardless of the obstacles involved." Jake Morrison, who had been silent during Jerry's demonstration, finally spoke up. "That's an impressive collection of coins, Sheriff. But it doesn't change the fact that the silver dollar robbers are still free, and the stolen silver hasn't been recovered." Jerry looked directly at Morrison, his expression calm but his eyes hard. "Mr. Morrison, you're absolutely right that the robbers haven't been captured yet, but they will be. In fact, I'm confident that arrests will be made within the next 48 hours. "How can you be so sure?" Morrison challenged. "You don't even know who committed the robbery." Jerry smiled for the first time since arriving in Prosperity Creek, and there was something in that smile that made Morrison take a step backward. "Mr. Morrison, I know more about this robbery than you might think. I know it was committed by local criminals who are familiar with mining operations and explosives. I know they were led by a large man who seems to have a personal grudge against me. And I know they made several mistakes that will allow me to identify and arrest them. The crowd was hanging on every word, fascinated by this new side of their sheriff that they were seeing for the first time. Jerry had their complete attention now, and he intended to use it to maximum effect. Furthermore, Jerry continued, I know that the stolen silver ore will have to be disposed of through local contacts, because it's too heavy and too distinctive to transport very far. And I know that the criminals involved are probably feeling quite confident right now, thinking that they've proven their superiority over the new sheriff. Jerry's eyes never left Morrison's face as he delivered his final statement. Their confidence is about to prove to be their downfall. After the crowd dispersed, Jerry returned to his office and began implementing the investigation plan he'd been developing since first examining the crime scene at the Silver Dollar Mine. His display of the silver coins had served multiple purposes. It had demonstrated his competence and experience to the community. It had put the real criminals on notice that they were dealing with a more formidable opponent than they'd assumed. And it had provided him with the credibility he needed to take more aggressive investigative actions. Jerry's first step was to send telegrams to law enforcement contacts throughout Colorado and neighboring territories, describing the robbery and requesting information about similar crimes and known criminals who might be responsible. His network of professional contacts, built up over 20 years of law enforcement work, was one of his most valuable resources in complex investigations. His second step was to begin surveillance of the most likely suspects, particularly Jake Morrison and his associates. Jerry knew that he couldn't conduct this surveillance personally due to his physical limitations and his high visibility as the new sheriff, but he had other options available. Among Jerry's hidden resources was a network of informants and part-time agents who could be activated when special investigations required capabilities beyond those of conventional law enforcement. These were men who had worked with Jerry in previous jurisdictions, individuals who could blend into criminal environments and gather intelligence without arousing suspicion. Jerry sent coded telegrams to two of these agents, both of whom were currently working in Colorado mining towns and could reach Prosperity Creek within a day or two. When they arrived, they would pose as drifters or temporary workers while actually gathering intelligence about Morrison's organization and looking for evidence connecting them to the Silver Dollar robbery. Jerry's third step was to implement measures designed to make the criminals overconfident and encourage them to make mistakes that would provide evidence for their prosecution. The best way to do this was to appear to be failing in his investigation while actually gathering intelligence about their activities and planning. Over the next 2 days, Jerry made a show of conducting conventional investigative activities that were doomed to failure. He questioned witnesses who had nothing useful to tell him. He searched areas where he knew the criminals had never been, and he generally gave the impression of a sheriff who was in over his head and grasping at straws. Meanwhile, his network of contacts was providing him with crucial intelligence about the crime and the criminals responsible. The stolen silver ore had indeed been processed through a smelting operation in a neighboring town, with the refined silver being sold to dealers who asked no questions about its origin. The transaction had been conducted by Iron Mike Sullivan, positively identified by witnesses who knew him from previous dealings. More importantly, Jerry learned that the robbery had been planned during meetings in Morrison's saloon, with Morrison himself providing information about the mine's security procedures and the timing of ore shipments. Several of Morrison's associates had been seen spending unusually large amounts of money in the days following the robbery, purchasing expensive items and gambling with stakes far beyond their normal means. On the evening of his second day back in town, Jerry was ready to make his arrests, but he knew that apprehending Morrison and his associates would require careful planning and the element of surprise, because they were numerous, well-armed, and would certainly resist arrest violently if they had any warning of what was coming. Jerry's plan was to arrest the criminals during the evening hours, when they would be gathered in Morrison's saloon, but before they became too intoxicated to be handled safely. He would need help, but he couldn't rely on a conventional posse because word would leak out and warn the criminals. Instead, Jerry activated his network of special agents and informants, coordinating with them to surround Morrison's saloon and prevent escape while he entered the building to make the arrests. His agents had spent the previous day identifying all the exits from the building and positioning themselves to cover each one. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, Jerry limped slowly down Main Street toward Morrison's saloon, his walking stick tapping rhythmically on the wooden sidewalk. To casual observers, he appeared to be making another routine patrol, but concealed beneath his coat was the sawed-off shotgun that had served him well in similar situations. Jerry paused outside the saloon, listening to the sounds of conversation and gambling that indicated a normal evening's activities. Through the windows, he could see Morrison and several of his associates gathered around a poker table, engaged in what appeared to be a high-stakes game. Jerry pushed through the saloon's swinging doors and walked slowly into the main room, his eyes quickly scanning the crowd to identify potential threats and locate his primary targets. The conversations gradually died away as people noticed the sheriff's presence, and within moments, the entire saloon was silent. "Good evening, gentlemen," Jerry said in a calm, clear voice that carried to every corner of the room. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Sullivan, I need to speak with you." Jake Morrison looked up from his poker hand, his expression showing more irritation than concern. "Sheriff, as you can see, we're busy here. If you need something, you can wait until our game is finished." Jerry shook his head. "I'm afraid it can't wait, Mr. Morrison. You and Mr. Sullivan are under arrest for the robbery of the Silver Dollar Mine and the attempted murder of Pete Williams." The saloon erupted in shocked exclamations and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as men jumped to their feet. Iron Mike Sullivan's hand moved toward his gun, but he froze when he saw the barrel of Jerry's concealed shotgun appear from beneath his coat. "I wouldn't recommend it, Mr. Sullivan," Jerry said calmly. "This shotgun has a very wide pattern at close range, and I'm quite accurate with it despite my other physical limitations." Morrison stood up slowly, his face showing a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Sheriff, you're making a serious mistake. You have no evidence connecting us to any robbery, and you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble if you persist with these false accusations." Jerry reached into his coat pocket with his left hand and pulled out a sheet of paper, keeping his right hand ready to use the shotgun if necessary. "Mr. Morrison, this telegram contains a positive identification of Mr. Sullivan as the man who sold refined silver ore to dealers in Canyon City on the day after the robbery. The ore samples match those stolen from the Silver Dollar Mine, and the witness is prepared to testify in court." Iron Mike Sullivan's face went pale as he realized that his attempt to dispose of the stolen silver had been discovered and documented. "Sheriff, you can't prove anything. That witness could be lying." "Mr. Sullivan," Jerry replied, "the witness is a licensed assayer who keeps detailed records of all his transactions. He not only identified you from a photograph, but he also provided samples of the silver ore that match the mineral composition of the ore stolen from the Silver Dollar Mine." Jerry pulled out another document. "In addition, I have statements from 3 witnesses who saw you and your associates meeting with Mr. Morrison on the night before the robbery to discuss the mine's security arrangements and the timing of ore shipments." Morrison's confident facade was beginning to crack as he realized that Jerry had gathered far more evidence than anyone had expected. "Sheriff, even if you have some evidence, you're still just one man trying to arrest multiple armed suspects. How do you plan to take us all into custody?" Jerry smiled, and once again there was something in that expression that made his opponents nervous. "Mr. Morrison, you're making the same mistake that criminals have been making for 20 years. You're assuming that I'm working alone." At Jerry's signal, the doors and windows of the saloon were suddenly filled with armed men, all of them pointing weapons at the crowd inside. Jerry's network of agents had moved into position as planned, and Morrison's associates found themselves surrounded and outgunned. "Gentlemen," Jerry announced, "anyone who is not directly involved in the silver dollar robbery is free to leave. However, I must warn you that interfering with these arrests will result in charges of obstruction of justice and aiding and abetting known criminals." Most of the saloon's patrons quickly decided that discretion was the better part of valor and began filing out of the building, leaving only Morrison, Sullivan, and 3 of their closest associates to face arrest. "Mr. Morrison," Jerry said, as his agents began disarming and restraining the criminals, "I told you that effective law enforcement was about intelligence and preparation rather than physical intimidation. I hope this experience has been educational for you." Within an hour, all 5 men were securely locked in the jail cells behind the sheriff's office, and Jerry had recovered most of the money stolen from the silver dollar mine, along with evidence that would ensure their conviction in territorial court. The stolen silver ore, having already been sold and refined, couldn't be recovered. But Jerry had documented the entire transaction chain that would allow the mine owners to pursue civil remedies against the purchasers. Word of the dramatic arrests spread through Prosperity Creek within hours, completely transforming the community's perception of their new sheriff. The man who had been mocked and dismissed as incompetent had just pulled off one of the most sophisticated criminal investigations in the territory's history, using resources and methods that no one had suspected he possessed. The next morning, Jerry was awakened by a delegation from the town council, led by Mayor Crawford and including several prominent citizens who had been among his harshest critics. They found him in his office, working on the paperwork required to transfer his prisoners to the territorial courthouse for trial. "Sheriff Hawthorne," Mayor Crawford began, his tone completely different from the skepticism he'd shown during Jerry's first days in office, "we owe you an apology. It's clear that we seriously underestimated your capabilities and experience." Jerry looked up from his paperwork, his expression calm and professional. "Mayor Crawford, no apology is necessary. People often judge based on appearances, and I understand that my physical limitations and modest circumstances created doubts about my qualifications." Councilmember Hayes spoke up, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Sheriff, that was the most impressive piece of detective work any of us has ever seen. The way you gathered evidence, coordinated with outside agencies, and planned the arrests was absolutely masterful. More importantly," added Councilmember Mitchell, "you did it all while allowing us to think you were failing. That took incredible self-control and strategic thinking." Jerry set down his pen and looked at the assembled men. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your praise, but I want you to understand something important. What happened last night wasn't just about arresting the men who robbed the silver dollar mine. It was about establishing the principle that law and order will prevail in Prosperity Creek, regardless of how powerful or well-connected the criminals might be." Mayor Crawford nodded. "We understand that, Sheriff. And we want you to know that you have the complete support of the town council and the entire community. Is there anything we can do to help you in your work?" Jerry considered the question carefully. "Actually, there are several things that would help me maintain effective law enforcement in this community. First, I'd like to hire a full-time deputy to help with routine patrols and investigations. Second, I'd like to establish better communications with law enforcement agencies throughout the territory. And third, I'd like to work with the community to develop crime prevention programs that will reduce the need for dramatic arrests like last night." "Done," Mayor Crawford said immediately. "Whatever you need, Sheriff, you'll have it. This community has learned not to question your methods or judgment." Thus, over the following weeks, Jerry's transformation from a figure of mockery to a respected lawman became complete. His successful resolution of the silver-dollar robbery had demonstrated that he possessed resources and capabilities far beyond what anyone had imagined, and his reputation spread throughout the territory as word of his methods and success reached other law enforcement agencies. The suitcase of silver coins, which had once been an object of derision, became a symbol of Jerry's competence and experience. People began to understand that each coin represented not just a reward earned, but a criminal brought to justice and a community made safer through his efforts. More importantly, Jerry's success in Prosperity Creek attracted the attention of territorial officials who were struggling to maintain law and order in other mining towns throughout Colorado. Within 6 months, Jerry was offered a position as a territorial marshal, with authority over multiple jurisdictions and resources that would allow him to implement his methods on a much larger scale. But Jerry declined the promotion, choosing instead to remain as sheriff of Prosperity Creek. He'd found a community that appreciated his unique approach to law enforcement, and he'd established relationships and systems that were producing real results in reducing crime and improving public safety. The town that had once mocked the limping sheriff with the battered suitcase now took pride in having one of the most effective lawmen in the Western Territories. Children would point him out to visitors as the sheriff who had fooled everyone with his modest appearance while secretly being one of the most successful criminal investigators in the region. Jerry's walking stick, which had once been seen as a symbol of his physical limitations, became a familiar and reassuring sight on the streets of Prosperity Creek. People would greet him respectfully as he made his daily patrols, and criminals from other areas learned to avoid a town that was under the protection of a sheriff who was far more dangerous than he appeared. The silver coins remained Jerry's secret resource, available for use when special circumstances required extraordinary measures. But as his reputation grew and his network of contacts expanded, Jerry found that he needed to rely on dramatic gestures less and less frequently. His established reputation was often sufficient to deter criminal activity and encourage cooperation from witnesses and informants. Years later, when Jerry finally retired from law enforcement, the people of Prosperity Creek erected a statue in the town square commemorating his service. The statue depicted him as he was, a man with a walking stick and a modest appearance, but with eyes that held the intelligence and determination that had made him such an effective guardian of law and order. The inscription on the statue read, "Jeremiah Hawthorne, Sheriff of Prosperity Creek, 1881-1895. A reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that true strength comes from wisdom, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice." But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Jerry's legacy was the transformation of Prosperity Creek itself. What had once been a lawless mining town plagued by violence and disorder became one of the safest and most prosperous communities in Colorado Territory. Families felt safe raising their children there. Businesses thrived in an environment free from the fear of robbery and violence, and the town became a model for how effective law enforcement could transform a frontier community. Jerry's battered suitcase, with its collection of silver coins, was eventually donated to the Territorial Museum in Denver, where it became part of an exhibit on frontier law enforcement. Visitors would examine the coins and read the stories of the cases they represented, gaining insight into the reality of police work in the American West. The exhibit's placard explained, "This collection represents more than 20 years of successful law enforcement by Sheriff Jeremiah Hawthorne. Each coin was earned through the patient investigation and successful prosecution of criminal cases that made frontier communities safer for law-abiding citizens." The collection serves as a reminder that the most effective lawmen were often those who relied on intelligence and determination rather than physical intimidation. Jerry himself lived quietly in Prosperity Creek until his death in 1903, continuing to serve the community as an advisor to younger lawmen and as a symbol of what could be accomplished through dedication and perseverance. He never married, having devoted his life entirely to his work, but he was surrounded by friends and admirers who valued his wisdom and experience. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from throughout Colorado Territory, including many of the criminals he had arrested and who had later reformed their lives, partly as a result of his influence. Former territorial governors, judges, and law enforcement officers came to pay their respects to a man who had quietly transformed law enforcement in the American West. The final testament to Jerry's legacy came from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison, the former saloon owner who had spent 5 years in territorial prison for his role in the Silver Dollar robbery. Upon his release, Morrison had returned to Prosperity Creek and established a legitimate business, crediting Jerry's influence for his decision to abandon criminal activities. "Sheriff Hawthorne taught me that crime doesn't pay," Morrison said at Jerry's funeral. "Not because the punishment is severe, but because he showed me that there are better ways to live. He gave me a second chance when I got out of prison, and he helped me understand that a man's worth isn't measured by how much fear he can inspire, but by how much good he can do." This incredible tale reminds us that true strength lies not in physical power or intimidating appearance, but in wisdom, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to doing what's right. Sheriff Jeremiah Hawthorne's story shows us that those who are underestimated often possess the greatest hidden strengths, and that patience and intelligence can triumph over force and intimidation. In a world that often judges by appearances, Jerry's legacy stands as proof that the most profound changes come from those who quietly demonstrate excellence through their actions rather than their words. If this story of hidden strength and ultimate triumph has inspired you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales from history, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that appearances can indeed be deceiving. After all, we never know when our own quiet determination might prove more powerful than anyone could have imagined.